The small diner stood quietly on the corner of 5th Street, where it had been for 30 years now, and the afternoon sun came through the windows, making long shadows on the old checkered floor that Diane Carter had mopped 1,000 times before. She wiped down the counter with steady hands that never shook even after hours of standing and serving customers who came in for coffee and comfort food. Diane was 48 years old with dark skin that showed smile lines around her eyes and a way of standing that was always perfectly straight, like she was still in uniform, even though she had left the military 3 years ago. The lunch crowd had gone home, and now only a few people sat in the booths eating pie and drinking coffee, while reading newspapers or staring at their phones. She knew most of them by name and knew what they ordered before they even sat down, because that was the kind of place this was. Mr. Patterson came in every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, and Diane already had his coffee ready, in his favorite blue mug that had a small chip on the handle that he liked to rub with his thumb while he read. He smiled at her when he shuffled through the door, and she smiled back with genuine warmth, because he reminded her of her own grandfather, who had passed away while she was overseas on her second tour. The diner was hers now, and she had bought it with her retirement savings after 22 years in the United States Marine Corps, where she had learned how to do things that most people could not imagine and seen things that she tried hard not to remember when she laid down to sleep at night. There was a photograph behind the register that most customers never noticed because it was partially hidden by the coffee machine, and it showed a younger version of Diane in her dress uniform with medals pinned across her chest and her face serious and proud. She did not talk about those days much because civilian life was supposed to be different and peaceful, and she wanted it to stay that way. The diner had become her safe place where the routines were simple and predictable, and nobody shot at her or asked her to make life and death decisions before breakfast. She poured coffee and flipped eggs and made small talk about the weather, and that was enough. Outside the window, she noticed a group of young men gathering on the sidewalk, and they were loud and shoving each other in that aggressive way that made people cross the street to avoid them. There were 5 of them wearing matching colors that marked them as part of one of the local street gangs that controlled several blocks in this neighborhood. Diane kept wiping tables, but her awareness sharpened the way it always did when potential danger appeared, and she had learned in combat zones across 3 continents to trust that instinct that told her when things were about to go wrong. The young men stood outside for several minutes, laughing too loud and making pedestrians nervous before the door finally swung open, hard enough to bang against the wall. They came in bringing tension with them like a cold wind, and the few remaining customers looked up and then quickly looked down at their food, hoping to be invisible. The one in front had a scar running down his left cheek, and his name was Kyle, and he looked around the diner with eyes that evaluated everything like he was shopping for something to steal. Diane straightened up and met his eyes directly without fear or challenge, just steady, calm attention. She asked what she could get for them, and her voice was polite but not warm. Kyle grinned, but there was no friendliness in it, and he said something about the place being nice and cozy, while his friends spread out through the diner touching things that did not belong to them. One of them ran his finger along the counter checking for dust, while another one picked up a salt shaker and tossed it from hand to hand like he was thinking about breaking it. Diane asked again if they were ordering food or just looking around, and Kyle stepped closer to the counter, invading her personal space in a way that was meant to make her uncomfortable and afraid. He started talking about protection, and how the neighborhood had bad elements and how her diner could use some security. His voice was slow and deliberate, like he was explaining something simple to a child. Diane said she could take care of herself, and Kyle laughed like that was the funniest thing he had heard all day. He said she had no idea what she was dealing with, and his friends laughed too, because they thought this was easy, and that she would fold under pressure like everyone else did. Another one of them moved to block the door so nobody could leave, and Mr. Patterson looked worried, but Diane gave him a small shake of her head that meant stay calm and stay quiet. Kyle leaned on her counter and explained how protection worked, and said she would need to pay $500 a week to keep trouble away from her business. Diane said she was not interested, and her voice was flat and final. The temperature in the room dropped, and Kyle stopped pretending to be friendly. He asked if she thought she had a choice, and one of his friends went behind the counter without permission and opened the cash register, taking out bills and counting them while making comments about how much money she had made today. Diane told them once in a voice that had commanded soldiers in firefights to put the money back and leave her diner and never come back. For just a second, the one holding the money hesitated, because something in her tone made his instinct scream danger. But then Kyle laughed again, and the moment passed. He picked up a salt shaker and dropped it on the floor where it shattered and said, "Accidents happen all the time," in a voice that was pure threat. Diane watched the broken salt shaker on her floor and felt something old and familiar wake up inside her chest like a sleeping animal opening its eyes after a long rest. Kyle was still talking about protection money and accidents while his friend, Marcus, counted her cash register money with dirty hands that left smudges on the bills she had earned through honest work. She had tried to handle this peacefully because she had left the war behind 3 years ago and did not want violence to follow her into this new quiet life. But these young men were not giving her a choice anymore. One of them, named Kevin, grabbed a chair and threw it against the wall hard enough to crack the paint, and Mr. Patterson flinched in his booth, but Diane did not move at all. Her body had gone very still in the way that combat veterans recognized as the moment before action, when all the chaos narrowed down to a single focused point. Kyle said she needed to be smart about this and just pay the money, but Diane interrupted him in a voice that was much quieter than before. She said she was not calling the police because she did not need them, and Kyle looked confused for a second because that was not how this usually went. People were supposed to be scared and either pay up or call for help, but she was doing neither, and it threw off his script. He asked if she had a death wish and tried to sound tough, but there was a question in his voice now. Brandon, who was blocking the door, made a joke about her thinking she was tough, and the others laughed, but the laughter sounded forced and nervous. Diane reached under the counter slowly, and every gang member tensed up thinking she was going for a gun, but what she pulled out was a folded piece of cloth. She unfolded it carefully and laid it flat on the counter where they could all see the Marine Corps flag with its eagle and globe and anchor in bright colors against red and gold fabric. She told them her name was Diane Carter, and that she was a gunnery sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, retired after 22 years of service. She said she had done 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, plus classified operations in 4 other countries that she could not talk about even now. Her voice was calm, like she was reading a grocery list, but every word landed like a hammer. She explained that she had conducted urban combat operations in places that made this neighborhood look safe, and that she had provided security against insurgent forces who were much more dangerous than 5 street thugs. Marcus had stopped counting money and was listening now with his mouth slightly open. Kyle tried to recover his confidence and said he did not care about war stories because that was then and this was now, and she was just one woman against 5 of them. Diane nodded like she agreed with him, and then she said something that made the air in the diner feel colder. She said combat was not about numbers, but about training and discipline, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to complete the mission. She said she had trained her entire adult life for situations exactly like this, while they had only street experience, and those 2 things were not the same at all. She told them to put her money back in the register and apologized to Mr. Patterson for disturbing his peaceful afternoon and then walk out the door and never come back. She said this was their only warning, and her eyes were hard like stone. Kyle grabbed Marcus and told him not to put the money back because they were not going to be disrespected by some old lady who thought she was special. Kevin decided to prove something and moved toward Diane fast, with his hand reaching out to grab her shoulder or shove her, or do something violent. What happened next was almost too fast to see clearly. Diane's hand caught his wrist in midair and twisted it in a direction wrists were not meant to go, while her other hand struck his elbow joint with perfect precision. Kevin made a sound that was half surprise and half pain as his aggressive charge turned into an awkward stumble forward. Diane used his own momentum to guide him face first into the counter, where she pinned his arm behind his back in a hold that looked almost gentle, but had him gasping. She told him quietly to stay down, and her voice had not changed at all, like disabling a grown man was just another routine task. The other 4 stood frozen for 1 heartbeat while their brains tried to process what their eyes had just seen. Then Brandon charged from the door using his weight like a weapon, while Marcus came around the counter from the other side. Kyle and Chris moved to surround her from different angles. Diane released Kevin, who slumped to the floor, and she had maybe 2 seconds before they all reached her at once. Brandon got there first with his arms spread wide to tackle her, but Diane stepped sideways into his charge instead of away from it. Her elbow drove into his stomach with surgical accuracy, right in the spot that would empty his lungs completely. As he bent forward, gasping, she brought her knee up into his face, not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to make him forget where he was. He went down in a heap. Marcus had pulled a knife from somewhere, and that changed everything because knives were lethal and required different responses than fists. He thrust the blade at her midsection in a clumsy attack that had more anger than skill behind it. Diane sidestepped and trapped his knife hand against her body, while her other hand struck his throat just hard enough to make him panic about breathing. His fingers opened automatically and the knife clattered across the floor under a booth far out of reach. Marcus joined the others on the ground, clutching his throat. Kyle and Chris had backed away now, with fear replacing the cocky confidence they had walked in with. Diane stood perfectly calm and barely breathing hard while 3 of their crew lay groaning on her floor. She told them this was their last chance to walk away, and her voice was still quiet and controlled. Kyle's hand moved to his waistband and pulled out a cheap pistol that looked like it had not been cleaned. In months, and Diane's eyes locked onto the weapon with the kind of focus that could only come from years of training. She calculated distance and angles and grip strength and stance all in the split second it took for Kyle to point the gun at her with shaking hands. His finger was already on the trigger instead of resting on the guard, which meant he was untrained and scared, and that made him more dangerous than someone who actually knew what they were doing. The distance between them was about 12 feet, and Diane knew from experience that she could close that gap in less than 2 seconds if she needed to. But right now, she stayed perfectly still. Chris moved toward the cash register, trying to grab money while keeping one eye on Diane because he had finally realized she was the real threat in this room. Mr. Patterson spoke up from his booth and begged them to just take the money and leave, but his voice was shaky with fear. Diane glanced at him with soft eyes and told him everything would be fine. Kyle shouted, asking how it could be fine when he had a gun and she had nothing. His voice cracked with panic and his whole body was tense like a wire pulled too tight. Diane said in a very calm voice that her Marine training had taught her how to disarm someone holding a weapon incorrectly from 12 feet away. She said it also taught her how to read body language and predict movement before it happened. She explained that the person who stayed calm in a crisis was the person who survived, and right now she was very calm, while he was about 3 seconds away from hyperventilating. Kyle looked down at his own chest and realized she was right because his breathing had gone fast and shallow without him noticing. Diane continued talking in that same steady voice and told him he had to make a choice now. He could pull the trigger, which would bring every police officer in 5 miles running to this location, or he could put the weapon down and help his friends up and leave. She said those were his only 2 options and everything else was just fantasy. Kyle said he could kill her, but his voice had no conviction behind it anymore. Diane acknowledged that he could try, but then explained exactly what would happen if he did. She said even if he hit her with a shot, it would not drop her immediately, because she had been shot before during her second tour in Afghanistan, and knew what it felt like, and knew how to function through the pain. She said in the 3 to 5 seconds it would take for a non-fatal gunshot to actually stop her, she would cross the distance between them and take his weapon away. Then he would be looking at attempted murder charges and life in prison. She asked if that was really how he wanted his life to end. The gun wavered in his hand, and Kyle looked at his crew on the floor groaning and holding injured body parts. He looked at Diane, who had not moved an inch and whose eyes were steady and certain. He looked at his own shaking hands and finally understood that he had made a terrible mistake coming here. Chris grabbed his arm and said they needed to leave right now because this situation was completely wrong. For a long moment nothing happened, and the diner was silent except for heavy breathing and the soft music playing from the radio behind the counter. Then slowly Kyle lowered the gun but kept it in his hand like it could still protect him somehow. He told his friends to get up, and his voice was harsh, trying to cover his fear. Kevin struggled to his feet, holding his injured arm close to his body. Brandon rose with one hand on his stomach where Diane's elbow had driven out all his air. Marcus was slowest getting up, still coughing and rubbing his throat where she had struck him. Kyle pointed at Diane and said she would regret this because nobody disrespected them and got away with it. The threat sounded empty and hollow, and everyone in the room knew it. Diane did not respond at all, just watched them move toward the door with eyes that tracked every motion. Brandon paused at the door and looked back at her with confusion on his face, like he could not understand what had just happened. He asked what she was, and his voice was quiet. Diane said she was just a diner owner and a Marine in that order. The door swung shut behind them and through the window. She watched them limp down the street with all their swagger gone, replaced by the walk of young men who had just learned that the world was more dangerous than they thought. The silence after they left was heavy and complete. Then Mr. Patterson let out a long breath and said he had been coming to this diner for 15 years and never knew she could do that. Diane smiled a little and started cleaning up the broken salt shaker. She said that was kind of the point because she had not left the military to keep fighting. Mr. Patterson said she had just taken down 5 men, and one had a gun, and she made it look easy. Diane corrected him and said 4 because the one with the gun did not engage, and also they were untrained and overconfident, which made them easier to handle than they looked. She explained that real combat was ugly and fast and mostly about making the other person stop wanting to fight. Those boys did not know what they wanted when they walked in, and she just helped them figure it out. Mr. Patterson asked if they would come back, and Diane paused while sweeping up broken glass. She said she did not know because pride made people do stupid things, but fear made them do smart things. Right now they were scared, but whether that would last longer than their wounded pride remained to be seen. She finished cleaning and checked her cash register where Marcus had scattered bills across the counter. She gathered them up and put them back carefully. Mr. Patterson asked if she should call the police, but Diane said no immediately. He argued that they had threatened her and had weapons and assaulted her property. Diane sat down across from him and explained that calling police would mean statements and maybe charges that probably would not stick. Those boys would be back on the street in hours, and now they would be angry and humiliated and looking for revenge. The police could not protect her because they could barely protect themselves in this neighborhood. Mr. Patterson asked what she was going to do then. Diane poured herself a cup of coffee and said she would do what she always did, which was run her diner and serve good food and hope those boys were smart enough to learn from today. And if they were not smart enough, then she would do what she had always done in the service, which was adapt and improvise and overcome whatever challenge came next. 2 days passed and the diner stayed quiet, but Diane did not relax because she knew from experience that quiet moments could explode into chaos without warning. She slept badly with her old instincts keeping her alert for sounds that did not belong in the night. Every car that passed on the street below her apartment made her eyes open in the darkness. She had retrieved her service weapon from the safe where it had sat unused for 3 years, and now it rested in a holster under the counter within easy reach. The morning after the confrontation, Mr. Patterson had not shown up for his usual breakfast, and that worried her more than she wanted to admit. By the 3rd day, when he still had not appeared, she knew something was wrong. Her regular customers came and went, and she served them with her usual efficiency, but part of her attention was always on the street outside watching for trouble. It arrived at 2 in the afternoon in the form of a black car that was too expensive for this neighborhood. 2 men got out, and they were nothing like the young gang members from before. These men were older with hard faces and the kind of confidence that came from years of violence that had been refined into professional skill. They walked into the diner, and immediately every customer found a reason to leave quickly. Within a minute, Diane was alone with them. The tall one had gray hair and cold eyes that evaluated everything in the room, like he was doing math in his head about how much it would cost to destroy it all. The shorter one was built like a concrete block with shoulders that did not fit through doorways easily. Neither one showed weapons, but Diane knew they were armed, because men like this were always armed. The tall one asked if she was Diane Carter, and his tone said he already knew the answer. She confirmed her name and asked what she could get them. He said he wanted information and pulled out a chair, sitting down like he owned the place. He said he understood she had trouble with some local boys 2 days ago. Diane kept her voice neutral and asked if she had. The man smiled, but it was the smile of a predator. He said they should not play games because Kyle and his crew worked for him, and that made yesterday's incident his business. He introduced himself as Vincent and the other man as Paul. Diane asked what they wanted. Vincent explained that they ran operations in this area, and Kyle's crew worked under their direction. He said what she did had caused problems because when a crew got taken down by a diner owner, it made his whole organization look weak. Diane said she did not want trouble, and they came in making demands and got aggressive, so she defended herself. Vincent laughed and said defending herself was an understatement, because she hospitalized 3 people. He said Kyle was having nightmares and Marcus could barely talk. Diane said they would heal. Vincent leaned forward and his friendly mask slipped, showing something dangerous underneath. He said physically they would heal, but their reputation was destroyed, and in his business reputation was everything. When word got out that 5 men ran away from 1 woman, it made his whole operation look like a joke. Weakness got people killed in his line of work. Paul spoke for the first time, and his voice was surprisingly soft. He said they needed to know if Diane was going to be a problem, because they had ways of solving problems. Diane's hand moved closer to the space under the counter. She asked what kind of solution they had in mind. Vincent said they had done research on her after the incident. They made calls to people who knew people. He said it turned out she was legitimate with 22 years in the Marines and expert training in about a dozen ways to hurt people. He said they respected that and wanted to make her an offer. Diane said immediately she was not interested in working for criminals. Vincent told her to hear them out first. He explained she obviously could handle herself and had valuable skills. They had operations that needed someone with her expertise for security work and training, and maybe collection when people refused to pay. The money would be good and she would work with professionals instead of street-level amateurs. Diane studied the two men and recognized what they were. They had turned violence into a business and justified it with talk about professionalism and organization. They were more dangerous than Kyle's crew because they were smarter and more patient. She said no firmly. Paul's expression got harder and he said she should think carefully about that answer. Diane said she had thought about it. She explained that she spent 22 years following orders and doing what needed to be done for her country. When she retired, she promised herself she was done with violence unless absolutely necessary. She did not work for criminals no matter how professional they thought they were. Vincent's friendly act disappeared completely. He said she was making a mistake because they were offering her a chance to be part of something bigger than her sad little diner. She was offering them nothing but defiance, and that was not smart business. Diane said maybe it was not smart, but it was the right thing to do. Vincent repeated her words with contempt in his voice. He said the right thing did not pay bills or keep people safe. The right thing was a luxury that people in her position could not afford. Diane said she would manage somehow. Paul stood up and his size suddenly seemed more threatening. He said she was not understanding the situation. They came to be reasonable and offered her a deal. She refused, which meant she was a problem that needed to be solved. Diane's hand closed around her weapon under the counter, but she did not draw it yet. She said they were welcome to try, but asked if it was really worth it. She pointed out she was one woman running a small diner, not trying to expand into their territory or challenge their operations. All she wanted was to be left alone. Vincent stood up and straightened his jacket. He said she embarrassed their people and showed they could be challenged. In their world, that kind of thing spread like disease. Next week, another shopkeeper would refuse to pay. Then another. Soon everyone would think they could stand up to his organization, and the whole thing would fall apart. So no, they could not just leave her alone. He asked if she understood that. Diane said she understood they were letting pride override good business sense. She said starting a war with her would cost more than just walking away. But she also understood men like him could not afford to appear weak. Vincent said he actually liked her because she was smart and direct and did not flinch. In another life, she would have made an excellent operator. But in this life, she was a complication that needed to be resolved. He said they would be in touch to discuss how to handle that complication. He told her to think about their offer and think about what happened to people who refused. The two men left as calmly as they had arrived, and Diane watched them drive away in their expensive car. She pulled out the weapon she had been holding and set it on the counter. She had hoped disabling Kyle's crew would end things, but she had been in combat long enough to know that was naive. She had challenged a power structure, and now they had to respond or lose face. The only question was what form that response would take and whether she would be ready when it came. That night after closing the diner, Diane sat in her small office staring at a phone she had not touched in 3 years. It was a burner phone from her days doing classified work, and she had kept it even though she promised herself she was done with that life. The phone had only a few numbers stored in it, and all of them belonged to people who understood the kind of trouble she was facing now. She picked it up and turned it on, and the screen glowed in the darkness. Using this phone meant crossing a line back into a world she had tried to leave behind. But Vincent's visit made it clear this was bigger than a simple street confrontation. She scrolled through the short contact list and stopped at one name. Lieutenant Commander Gregory Hayes was stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina and had been her commanding officer during her last tour overseas. He was someone who understood both the warrior code and the complicated reality of operating in gray areas between right and wrong. More importantly, he was someone she trusted with her life. She pressed the call button and waited while it rang 3 times. His voice came through sounding professional and alert. She identified herself and heard the surprise and warmth flood into his tone. He said her name with genuine happiness and asked how civilian life was treating her. Diane said it had been fine until yesterday, and now she had a situation that needed advice. The warmth in his voice immediately shifted to sharp focus, and he told her to explain. She laid out everything in clear military language, starting with Kyle's crew and ending with Vincent's threat. She included details about weapons and organizational structure, and her assessment of the danger level. When she finished, Gregory was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said she needed to call local police and the FBI because what she described was organized crime and racketeering. Diane said she could not do that. He asked why not. She explained it would take weeks or months to build a case while she remained a target. Police protection in her neighborhood was minimal at best. Testifying against organized crime would paint a target on her back forever, and most importantly, she had not survived 22 years in combat by waiting for someone else to save her. Gregory sighed, and she could picture him rubbing his face the way he did when facing a difficult tactical problem. He said she was not in a combat zone anymore, and there were systems for dealing with this kind of thing. Diane countered that those systems worked fine for people in safe neighborhoods, but she was not one of those people. Her customers were not protected. If she went to authorities, she became a snitch, and everyone around her became potential collateral damage. Gregory asked what she needed from him. She said she needed information and resources and backup plans. Vincent had checked on her background, so she needed to do the same with him. She needed to know who he was and what his operation looked like and where his weaknesses might be. Gregory pointed out that was intelligence gathering on civilian targets, and he could not officially help with that. Diane said she knew that, which was why she called his personal phone. She was not asking for official help. There was another pause, and then Gregory said he had to tell her officially to stand down and follow proper procedures and let the system work. Diane said she understood. He continued and said off the record between two Marines who trusted each other, she should check her email in about 2 hours. There might be some information about local criminal organizations in her area that he happened to have for a completely different research project. Diane felt relief wash through her. She thanked him, but he said not to thank him, just stay alive. He told her when this was over she needed to call him again, so they could discuss whether running a diner in a dangerous neighborhood was really the peaceful retirement she thought it was. After disconnecting, Diane spent the next 2 hours going through her apartment with military precision. She identified defensive positions and escape routes and cataloged everything that could be used as a weapon. Her civilian life had softened some edges, but the fundamental training remained embedded in her bones and muscles. She was still a Marine, even if she wore an apron instead of a uniform. At exactly 2 hours, an email arrived from an anonymous account with no message, just attachments. She opened them and found police reports and surveillance photos and detailed information about Vincent's operation. His full name was Vincent Moretti, and he ran a mid-level criminal organization controlling protection rackets and drug distribution and loan sharking across several neighborhoods. He was smart and careful and had avoided serious legal trouble by keeping operations compartmentalized. Street gangs did visible work while he stayed hidden, maintaining what lawyers called plausible deniability. The reports also showed weaknesses, though. His operation was built entirely on reputation and fear. If that reputation cracked, the whole structure would collapse. He had enemies in rival organizations who would be happy to see him fall. Most important, he had no experience dealing with trained military personnel. His world was street violence and intimidation of civilians. He had never faced someone who learned violence as a profession in the world's best military. Diane studied the information until her eyes burned and the sun started rising outside her window. By the time she finally went to bed, she had formulated a plan. It was risky and probably illegal in several ways, and absolutely necessary if she wanted to end this. She was not going to wait for Vincent to make his move. She had spent her whole military career being aggressive and taking initiative, and that was not going to change now. She was going to take the fight directly to him and hit him where it would hurt most. His reputation was his power, so she would destroy that reputation in a way he could not recover from. The next day, she opened the diner as usual and served customers with her normal efficiency, but part of her mind was already planning the operation. She would need to do reconnaissance first to confirm the intelligence Gregory sent. She would need to identify Vincent's headquarters and his security and his routines. She would need to pick the right moment when he felt safe and confident. and then she would strike hard and fast in a way that would make it clear that coming after her cost more than it was worth. That evening after closing, she changed into dark clothes and pulled out gear she had not worn since leaving the service. Her old tactical vest still fit perfectly, and her combat knife felt natural in her hand. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. She was not a diner owner right now. She was Gunnery Sergeant Diane Carter, and she had a mission to complete. The streets were dark as she moved through them using skills learned in a dozen different countries. She was invisible when she wanted to be, and right now she wanted to be a ghost. She found the warehouse that Gregory's intelligence identified as Vincent's main operations center. She watched it for 3 hours from different positions, noting guard rotations and security cameras and entry points. The guards were sloppy, spending more time on phones than actually watching. There were cameras, but also blind spots. There were always blind spots if you knew how to look. She returned to her apartment as dawn broke and added what she learned to her plan. Tomorrow night she would go back. Tomorrow night she would show Vincent that he had made a terrible mistake threatening her. The next night, Diane stood in shadows across from the warehouse, wearing all black with her tactical vest hidden under a jacket, and her face darkened with burnt cork, like she had done on night missions in Afghanistan. It was nearly midnight, and the industrial area was empty except for a few homeless people sleeping in doorways and the occasional security patrol driving past without stopping. Her reconnaissance had shown her the patterns, and now she waited with the infinite patience that came from spending days in sniper hides watching for targets. 4 guards worked in rotation with 2 inside and 2 walking the perimeter, but they were lazy and undisciplined, checking their phones more than their surroundings. Security cameras covered the main entrance and loading dock, but there were blind spots in the coverage that she had memorized. At 12:47, one of the outside guards walked around a corner to smoke a cigarette, leaving a section unwatched. She moved. 20 seconds later, she was pressed against the warehouse wall beneath a camera arc with a small device in her hand. It was an electromagnetic pulse generator that Gregory had somehow included in a package that arrived at her diner that morning, along with a note that said nothing except good luck. She pressed the button and the camera went dark. She had maybe 4 minutes before someone noticed the malfunction, so she used 2 of them to pick the lock on a side door, using skills she learned from military engineers who could break into anything. The door opened silently and she slipped inside. The warehouse was huge and dimly lit with pallets stacked high, creating corridors and hiding places. She could hear voices from the second-floor office area, but first she needed to handle the internal guards. The first one was leaning against a post watching something on his phone with earbuds blocking all sound. She approached from his blind side and her arm wrapped around his throat in a perfect chokehold before he knew anyone was there. He struggled for maybe 8 seconds before going limp. She lowered him quietly and secured his hands with zip ties and gagged him with his own shirt. The second guard was more alert and noticed his partner missing. He came looking, and Diane intercepted him at a corner using a takedown that was fast and brutal and completely silent. He joined his partner on the concrete floor, equally secured and unconscious. That gave her access to the stairs, which she climbed carefully, testing each step before putting weight on it to avoid creaks. At the top, she found a hallway with 3 doors, and light came from the middle one along with voices. She pressed her ear against the door and listened. Vincent was inside talking with Paul and at least 2 other men. They were discussing business and specifically discussing what to do about her. Vincent said she would not accept their offer, so they needed to make an example. Someone asked about collateral damage, and Vincent said there was always collateral damage, and that was the whole point. He wanted to hit her diner hard enough that everyone in the neighborhood knew what happened when people refused him. Diane's jaw tightened as she listened to them plan to destroy her business and hurt innocent customers, just to prove their power. She had heard enough. She kicked the door with enough force to tear it off its hinges, and it crashed inward. The 4 men inside barely had time to register her presence before she was moving. Paul started to rise, reaching for his weapon, but her hand clamped his wrist, stopping the draw, while her other hand struck his throat hard enough to make breathing his only concern. The second man got his gun clear, but Diane kicked the heavy metal table between them, and it hit his shins, dropping him. His gun fired into the ceiling, and the sound was deafening in the closed space. Vincent had backed toward another door, drawing his own weapon. He shouted for her to stop or he would shoot. Diane had taken the third man's gun from his holster before he processed what was happening, and now she pointed it at Vincent with hands that did not shake at all. Vincent said she would not shoot him, but his voice lacked confidence. Diane said he was right. She would not kill him, but she did not need to kill him to stop him. She adjusted her aim and fired. The bullet hit his shoulder, spinning him around, and he dropped his gun, screaming and clutching the wound. Diane moved quickly to secure the room and gathered all weapons, unloading them with practiced efficiency. Paul was still gasping on the floor. The man with damaged shins was groaning. The fourth man sat frozen with his hands up, making no attempt to resist. She pulled out her phone and took pictures of everything, including the money on the table and ledgers on the desk, and the men themselves. Then she pulled out a small recording device and placed it where they could all see it. She said she had been listening for 20 minutes and heard them planning to burn her diner. She had documented their operation, and now she would explain how things would work going forward. Vincent, still clutching his bleeding shoulder, said she was dead. Diane asked if she looked dead. She said if anything happened to her, all this information went to the FBI and DEA and every news organization in the city. His operation would be exposed and burned to the ground. His associates would scatter and his enemies would move in, and everything he built would disappear overnight. Vincent said she was bluffing through clenched teeth. Diane asked if she seemed like someone who bluffed. She pointed out she had just walked into his headquarters and taken down 4 armed men and shot him. Did that seem like bluffing? She told him what she wanted. She wanted to be left alone, and her diner left alone, and her customers left alone. She wanted every small business in her neighborhood left alone. He needed to find somewhere else to operate and leave this area entirely. Vincent said that was impossible. They could not abandon operations. Diane said then he needed to adapt and adjust and find other revenue streams. She asked if he was supposed to be smart because now was the time to prove it. Vincent asked what happened if they refused. Diane held up her phone and said she would press send, and all this became very public. She asked if he thought his suppliers would keep working with him under federal investigation. She asked if his street crews would stay loyal when police pressure increased. She asked if his rivals would not see this as an opportunity to take his territory. The room went quiet except for Vincent's heavy breathing and Paul's wheezing. She could see Vincent doing calculations behind his pain-filled eyes, weighing pride against survival and reputation against staying out of prison. He finally said she made an enemy tonight. Diane corrected him and said she made an enemy when she refused to be a victim. The difference was now he knew what kind of enemy she was. Now he knew that coming after her cost more than it was worth. She backed toward the door, keeping her weapon trained on them. She said she was leaving and taking their guns with her. The police would probably get an anonymous call about gunshots in about 10 minutes. She suggested they be gone by then. She told Vincent to get his shoulder treated by a private doctor, because hospitals meant reports and reports meant questions nobody wanted to answer. She was down the stairs and out the side door before anyone could respond. She moved through the industrial district like smoke disappearing into darkness. By the time police arrived, she was miles away, and the guns were disassembled and scattered in storm drains across the city, where they would never be found. A young woman came into the diner just before closing time, looking nervous and uncertain, like she was working up courage to speak. She stood near the door for a moment before finally approaching the counter. She asked if Diane was Diane Carter, and her voice trembled slightly. Diane said yes and asked how she could help. The woman hesitated, then seemed to gather her courage. She explained she owned a bakery 2 neighborhoods over and had been having trouble with local gangs demanding protection money. She said she heard what happened at this diner and how Diane stood up to them. She wanted to know if maybe Diane could give her some advice on how to do the same thing. Diane looked at this young woman and saw herself 3 months ago standing at a crossroads between submission and resistance. She gestured to a booth and said they should sit and talk. The woman sat down quickly, like she was afraid Diane might change her mind. She introduced herself as Carmen Rodriguez and explained her situation. A gang had approached her bakery last week, demanding $500 every week for protection. When she said she could not afford that, they broke her front window and threatened worse if she did not pay. She was scared but also angry because she had worked so hard to build her business and now criminals wanted to take it away. She did not want to pay them but did not know what else to do. The police said they would patrol more often, but nothing changed. She felt trapped and alone until she heard about Diane. Diane listened carefully and asked questions about how many gang members were involved and whether they carried weapons and how organized they seemed. Carmen answered everything she could remember. Diane nodded slowly, processing the information. She said the first thing Carmen needed to understand was that standing up to criminals was dangerous. There were no guarantees of safety or success. Carmen could get hurt, or her bakery could be destroyed, or things could get worse before they got better. She needed to count that cost before deciding anything. Carmen said she understood, but doing nothing felt worse than the danger. At least if she fought back, she would know she tried. Diane recognized that feeling from her own experience. She said, "Okay, then here was the advice. Never let them think they scared you, even if they did." Fear was natural and useful, but showing fear invited more aggression. Stand your ground firmly, but do not escalate unless necessary. Document everything they said and did, because evidence mattered if things went legal. Find other business owners in the same situation, because groups were harder to intimidate than individuals. And most important, know your own limits. Not everyone was trained for combat. Not everyone could handle physical confrontation. Carmen needed to be honest about what she could and could not do. Carmen asked if Diane would come with her to the bakery next time the gang showed up. Diane shook her head gently. She explained that would not help Carmen in the long run. If Diane fought her battles, then Carmen would never learn to fight her own. The gangs would just wait until Diane left and come back stronger. Carmen needed to find her own strength and her own way of resisting, but she was not alone. Diane gave her Lisa Chen's contact information and explained about the Veteran Business Defense Initiative. Even though Carmen was not a veteran, the program connected business owners facing similar problems. They had resources and legal support, and a network of people who understood what she was going through. Carmen's eyes filled with tears, and she thanked Diane multiple times. She said just knowing someone else had faced this and survived made her feel less alone. Diane walked her to the door and told her to be smart and be careful and remember that courage was not the absence of fear but action, despite fear. After Carmen left, Diane locked the door and began her closing routine. She wiped down counters and cleaned the grill and counted the register, simple tasks that grounded her in the present moment. As she worked, she thought about Lisa's words about veterans who forgot how to back down. Maybe that was true. Maybe something in military training changed people permanently, making them unable to accept defeat or submission. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she had just seen too much injustice in the world to tolerate more of it in her own neighborhood. The next morning started like any other morning, with truckers and early shift workers coming in for coffee and breakfast before dawn. Diane cooked eggs and bacon and made small talk about weather and sports scores. Everything felt normal and routine. Then around 9 o'clock, 2 police officers came in wearing serious expressions. Diane tensed instinctively, but they smiled and ordered coffee. The older officer, whose name tag said Rodriguez, introduced himself and his partner. He said they wanted to thank her for whatever she did that made their job easier in this neighborhood. Crime reports had dropped significantly in the past month. The protection rackets that used to plague every block had mysteriously stopped operating. He did not know exactly what happened and did not want to know officially, but unofficially he wanted to say thank you. Diane poured their coffee and said she just ran a diner. Officer Rodriguez smiled and said of course that was all she did. He left a business card on the counter and said if she ever needed anything from the police department, she should call him directly. Some people made communities better, and those people deserve support. After they left, Diane stared at the business card for a long time. She had spent 3 months afraid the police would come asking difficult questions about warehouse incidents and injured criminals. Instead, they came to thank her. The world was strange sometimes. The afternoon brought more customers, including several business owners from surrounding blocks. They came in 1 or 2 at a time, ordering food but really coming to see her and thank her. They said their businesses felt safer now. They said the gang members who used to harass them had disappeared or moved to other areas. They did not know exactly what changed, but they knew it was connected to her somehow. Diane accepted their thanks with quiet grace, but insisted she had only defended herself. She was not a hero or a vigilante, just a diner owner who refused to be a victim. But even as she said it, she knew something had shifted. She had become something more than just Diane Carter who ran a diner. She had become a symbol of resistance and proof that ordinary people could stand up to organized crime and win. That evening after closing, she went upstairs to her apartment and looked at the photograph she kept on her dresser. It showed her in full dress uniform on the day she retired from the Marine Corps. She had thought that day marked the end of her service and the beginning of something completely different. Now she understood it had only been a transition. She was still serving, just in a different way. Instead of defending her country overseas, she was defending her community here at home. Instead of following orders from commanders, she was following her own conscience. Instead of fighting with a platoon backing her up, she was fighting alone. but inspiring others to fight their own battles. She thought about Carmen at her bakery preparing to face her own gang confrontation. She thought about the other business owners who were finding courage to resist intimidation. She thought about Lisa Chen and her program connecting veterans across the country. She thought about Gregory still serving in the Marine Corps and about all the other men and women she had served with who were now scattered across America, building civilian lives. Maybe they were all still serving in ways they did not fully recognize. Maybe leaving the military did not mean leaving behind the values and skills and determination that defined them. Maybe it just meant finding new ways to apply those things to new challenges. Diane changed into comfortable clothes and made herself dinner in her small kitchen. She ate while watching the news and planning tomorrow's menu for the diner. Everything felt ordinary and peaceful. Outside her window, the neighborhood settled into evening routines. Lights came on in windows. People walked dogs. Cars drove past. It was just a normal night in a normal neighborhood. But Diane knew it was not quite normal, because normal meant accepting whatever criminals decided to impose. Normal meant paying protection money and living in fear and letting businesses die slow deaths from extortion. She had changed what normal meant in this neighborhood. She had raised the cost of intimidation high enough that criminals decided to go elsewhere. She had proven that resistance was possible and worthwhile. As she washed her dinner dishes, she felt contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she should be doing. She was Diane Carter, diner owner, and former Marine gunnery sergeant. She served breakfast to truckers and protected her community from predators. She made coffee and stood her ground against threats. She was both things at once, and both things mattered equally. Tomorrow she would open the diner at 5 in the morning. She would cook and serve and clean and smile at customers. She would live her quiet civilian life. But if trouble came again, she would be ready, because that was what Marines did. They adapted and improvised and overcame. They never quit and never surrendered. They served until the mission was complete, and the mission of protecting her community would never truly be complete. But that was okay, because she had finally found her place in the world, and it felt right. The diner was hers. 3 weeks passed, and Diane watched the news every day expecting reports about the warehouse incident, but there were none. Vincent had apparently taken her advice about avoiding hospitals and official reports because nothing appeared in police records or media coverage. More importantly, he seemed to have taken her other advice about leaving her neighborhood alone. The street gang members who worked for him no longer patrolled her block. The protection racket that had squeezed local businesses quietly stopped operating. According to neighborhood gossip, Vincent's operation had shifted to different areas, pursuing other opportunities and leaving this district alone. Diane wanted to believe it was over, but 22 years of military training made her cautious about declaring victory too early. She kept her weapon under the counter and maintained her defensive preparations in her apartment. She stayed alert for any sign of retaliation or revenge, but as days turned into weeks and weeks stretched toward a month, something began to shift inside her. The constant tension that had gripped her muscles since that first confrontation started to ease. She slept better with fewer nightmares about ambushes and firefights. Her customers noticed she seemed more relaxed and more like the friendly diner owner they remembered. From before all this trouble started, Mr. Patterson had returned to his regular schedule, the morning after her warehouse operation, showing up at his usual time for coffee and newspapers. She later learned that Kyle's crew had visited him after the first incident, warning him not to talk about what he witnessed, but they had not hurt him. After Vincent withdrew from the neighborhood, even those intimidation attempts stopped completely. One sunny afternoon, while Diane wiped down tables, the door opened, and a woman in a business suit walked in carrying a briefcase and wearing an expression of serious determination. She asked if this was Diane Carter's place, and Diane's hand moved instinctively toward the counter before she caught herself. The woman smiled in a tired way and said she was not there to threaten anyone. Her name was Lisa Chen, and she was an attorney representing the Small Business Association. She had been hearing interesting stories about this diner and wanted to learn more. Diane asked what kind of stories. Lisa said stories about protection rackets that suddenly stopped operating, and a former Marine who refused to be intimidated, and other business owners who suddenly felt safe running their shops without fear. She explained she was trying to document what happened because if it worked here, maybe it could work in other neighborhoods too. Diane brought coffee to the table and sat down. She said she was just a diner owner who defended herself and nothing more. Lisa smiled like she knew better. She mentioned the dramatic reduction in crime in this area and how Vincent Moretti's operation completely withdrew from this district and how all of it seemed connected to one person who knew how to fight back. Diane said she did not know anything about Vincent Moretti. Lisa said of course not. Just like Diane did not know about a warehouse incident that sent several people to private doctors for treatment. Just like she did not know why local police suddenly became interested in investigating protection rackets. Diane drank her coffee and said nothing. Lisa leaned forward and explained she was not trying to cause trouble. She said there was a pattern emerging across the country where military veterans came home and built civilian lives in difficult neighborhoods. Sometimes they defended themselves and sometimes they defended their communities. Sometimes they reminded criminals that some people would not accept being victims. Diane said that sounded like vigilantism. Lisa disagreed and said it sounded like self-defense and community protection. It sounded like someone using their training to solve problems that authorities could not or would not address. She pulled papers from her briefcase and explained she was starting a program called the Veteran Business Defense Initiative. It would provide legal protection and resources and support for military veterans who owned small businesses in high-crime areas. The program would help them navigate legal challenges and connect with other veterans and provide documentation that their actions were legitimate self-defense, not illegal vigilantism. She slid the papers across the table and said she wanted Diane to be one of the first participants. Diane's story, properly documented, could help dozens of other veterans facing similar situations. She could be a model for standing up to criminals without breaking laws. Diane looked at the papers but did not touch them. She said she was not a model for anything, just someone trying to run a diner in peace. Lisa said, and now she could do exactly that. But other people were in the same situation Diane had faced 3 months ago. They were being squeezed by criminals and afraid to fight back, watching their businesses and communities die. Diane had shown that resistance was possible. Did she not want to help others do the same? Diane was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up the papers and read them carefully. They were comprehensive and well-written, and seemed genuinely designed to protect veterans who found themselves in situations like hers. She asked if signing meant testifying against anyone, or providing evidence for prosecutions or becoming a police informant. Lisa said no. This was only about legal protection for Diane and support for her business. Nothing more than that. Diane read through everything twice before signing. As she handed the papers back, she felt something release inside her chest. For 3 months, she had been waiting for retaliation, living in constant vigilance, expecting violence. This felt like permission to finally breathe normally again. Lisa thanked her and said she had interviewed about a dozen veterans for this program. They all said the same thing when asked why they stood up to criminals. They all said they just wanted to be left alone to live in peace and run their businesses. Diane said that was true. Lisa said she believed that, but she also thought something else was true. She said all these veterans had forgotten how to back down. The military trained them to face impossible odds and accomplish undoable missions and never quit. They came home thinking they could turn that off, but they could not. And honestly, she was glad they could not, because neighborhoods like this needed people who did not know how to quit. After Lisa left, Diane stood at her window looking out at her block. The afternoon sun painted everything in golden light. Kids played basketball in the street. An elderly couple walked together to the corner store. Mr. Patterson sat in his usual booth reading his newspaper. It was just a normal day in a small neighborhood diner, which was exactly what Diane had been fighting for all along. Her phone rang and it was Gregory. He said he heard she made the news, sort of. Diane asked how he knew about that. He said he had sources and mentioned that an attorney contacted the Marine Corps to verify her service record. He said what she did would have consequences, and probably good ones, but consequences nonetheless. Diane said she was ready for whatever came. Gregory asked if she really was, because she was about to become a symbol for something bigger than just one diner owner defending property. Diane thought about that and then told him about the hardest part of leaving the service. She said it was feeling useless, like all her training and experience and years of dedication did not matter anymore, like she had been put on a shelf and forgotten. This situation, as terrible as it was, reminded her that she still had value. Her skills still mattered. She could still make a difference in the world. Gregory said she always had value and just needed to find the right way to use it. They talked a few more minutes before Diane had to return to work. As she served evening customers, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not happiness exactly, because the world was too complicated for simple happiness, but contentment. The sense that she was where she belonged, doing what she was meant to do. The diner was hers and the neighborhood was safer, and she had proven to herself that leaving the military did not mean becoming helpless.